Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young, and I'm trying to do some educational sessions on various policies that kind of keep it down to basic information in terms of directing people in terms of policy and understanding of government. Just the overall breaking down some of the statements made by either the Conservative Party of Canada under Stephen Harper, the NDP under Thomas Mulcair, or the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau. There's a lot of little bit of jargon and different words thrown around that kind of just to skew people into thinking, or maybe sometimes fear, or just understanding to low-informed voters. So what I've decided to do with some key policies, especially areas that are going to drive economic performance, is to break them down into a more simplistic state so that people can kind of understand that when they say something about a statement in terms of trade balances or exports or imports, you have a little bit more substance of what that actually means. So let's really talk about what a trade imbalance is. What that really means, as a country, Canada exports goods and services to other countries. That's part of the overall GDP and economic growth. What happens is if you import more than you export, so that you're bringing those goods and services into the country more than you're actually exporting, that basically leads to what we call as an imbalance. So that's the statement you're hearing from Ralph Goodale, who's made a post on Huffington Post, Don Davies, who's the NDP critic. They constantly talk about that deficit, and basically as a way to say that Stephen Harper's trade policies are not working. So in other words, he's saying that he's not been able to grow exports, or we've had too much dependencies on imports. They're not clear on the definition of where the imbalance is, and I'll walk you through that in terms of the aspects of it, in terms of government policies and what that means. What I really want to illustrate is that's what they're saying at a high level. So let's talk about what Canada does. Canada looks at different ways to kind of help businesses to expand. It's not like you just go knocking on the door to India and say, I'm going to open up a business here. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of bureaucracy that you have to go through when you start dealing with other countries in terms of how they organize businesses, their own little rules around directors, just organization of companies there, who can own them and all that. Like for example, in China, is a lot of foreign subsidiary companies can't own more than 50% of the company there, so the Chinese government owns a good portion of that. So that's kind of the way in terms of certain governments' role. Now if you really think of it, if you're looking at a model how the NDP operates, they operate a lot similar to how basically China operates. Is they would have more controls around who comes in and owns ownership of companies and resources as a way to dictate to how they will operate, right? That is similar to their charter, and if you don't believe me, you can go out and do a Google search of the NDP party, since they were enacted in 1961 as a combination of the Social Party out there and the Canadian Labour Congress, so you can kind of get that. But really what I want you to see here is you've got FIPA, and that's basically Foreign Investment Protection Agreements. Basically these are things where if you want to invest in companies into China, or China wants to invest into Canada, there's certain protection we put around there. It's part of ensuring we get investment, but also ensuring that the partners or stakeholders that are trying to deal with us to help develop, or vice versa in other countries, there's angles or protections around these people in terms of investing. Yeah, you're going to hear constantly about lawsuits. Yes, there's lawsuits that can come into play, but that's the worst extreme in the whole history of NAFTA. And we've done trillions in dollars of GDP business. Canada's lost very, very few lawsuits, and the percentage of that is very, very low. So the bulk of trade basically that goes to any type of country, especially when I use NAFTA as an example, the outcome of a lawsuit is very rare and very low. So you only hear the negativity, we've lost lawsuits, but the NDP is good at pandering to that and say we've lost lawsuits, so that means trade deals haven't due. But you need to look at the magnitude of those trade deals in terms of the volume of trade that's going between countries, and look at the amount of payout. If the payout is really less than, and when I looked at it, it was less than 0.2%, that's pretty low payout due to the volume. So you need to bear that in mind, and that's over a period at times of 25 years. The next chart I want to show you, these are deals that are basically Canada's done. They've done a deal with South Korea, which is the newest deal, just came into play. We've got one in play with CETA, which is Central European Trade Agreement. That's also signed. They're working on different deals down below with India, and Japan, but some of those deals are being held off, and that's because they're working on a Pacific trade pack. Now, you're going to hear a lot of inklings and angles about this, that they're closed doors. Typically with any trade agreements, and you may want to do this as part of your research, you can go out to the Government of Canada's website and look at the trade committees. A lot of the discussions preliminary are on trade in terms of concerns. Go through committee meetings, and that means even so, like the dairy industry would come in because we highly subsidize it, not subsidize, but put protections in there. That's where we have quotas in. Other industries as well to kind of protect them and to insulate them, right? So you'll see comments about that. I would say, as you're going through this, do not take the government's value information at face value. Do not take the unions at face value. What you need to do is kind of look at different perspectives to get all angled. Typically the NDP only looks at one angle, and that's to play to their strong suit. That's the union. The government may look just basically they look at their stakeholders a lot more. They look at basically both business, and they also look at basically trade associations as well to make sure they have input, and also the consumers. It may not be that way. You may not get that indication from Stephen Harper, but he does kind of involve a lot more people. He does care about this country, so he does want to make sure that he gets the right deals in play. So let's talk about the magnitude of trade, and I've mentioned this in several of my videos. Currently, exports are about 530 billion. Okay, 530 billion. If you look at Canada's GDP, is about $2 trillion. So about 25% of our GDP is really tied to exports, and that makes sense because of a country of about 36 million people, we don't have the consumer marketplace for all the goods and services we would manufacture or extract here. So we have a dependency to export goods and services outside our country, and part of that is you need to have the right deals in place to ensure that you can expand those exports. In the 90s, when the Liberals were in party, and they don't tell you that, they signed roughly about 4 trade deals. And they didn't even put a lot of focus on key markets, the growth markets. And we call them emerging markets for a reason. These are markets that are now starting to grow on middle class, and they're like Vietnam. They're like China. They're like India. They're like African countries. You're starting to see where that, when you start developing middle class, they need like goods and services. Take a look at your life cycle. What do you own? Usually a house, a car, appliances and all that. You're spending money. That spending money is consumer money, right, that you're spending within the country, but you need the raw materials of the finished goods in order to sell that. So Canada's targeting areas to help continually push their export agenda. Now you may argue that it's not the right thing to do, but in general, if you take $530 billion worth of export sales, okay, and if you take on average a Canadian corporation that makes or manufactures that good, and just to give you a clarification, that 44% of the goods that we export are finished goods, so 56 are raw materials. So let's just say that we've exported that out. That's produced here in this country and shipped out. Now let's say that the average net profit margin, actually net income, is about 12%. So let's say in general these corporations are generating $60 billion of net income before taxes. Okay, so if the taxation rate in Canada combined is close to about 30%. So if you're talking about basically $60 billion in basically net income before taxes, you're actually talking a good chunk of corporate tax. That's just corporate tax that's going to basically to support social programs. Now if you do not have exports, then you're not putting a focus on exports, then you're also putting more pressure on your existing taxation in the consumer markets to pick up that gap that you're not expanding in exports. That's not something you're going to hear from the opposition party. What they want to do is saying their trade policies of the federal government aren't working. But they are in generally working, because we went from, in 2009, exports of about 368 billion to basically over 526. And I'll go in more specific details on that, but this graph is kind of show you the impact of it. I'm going to make some comments here now. Ralph Goodale was a former finance minister. He typically likes to extenuate the circumstances with the NDP, but the Conservative Party of Canada. So he made a comment that we've had trade imbalances. That's all he's made. He's made that statement, we've had trade imbalances. He's never really clarified what a trade imbalance is, and I did talk about that a little earlier. Don Davies has said the same thing, is we've had trade imbalances for the past decade, which one thing he hasn't said, in 2011 and 2014 we had an annual surplus. That's never been stated by either Don Davies or Ralph Goodale. You don't have to trust me. You can go to Statistics Canada site and go a search on exports and take a look at by year. You will see that we've had that basically surpluses in a couple of those years. Let's look at exports. We still have a dependency on the US, so about 75 cents of every dollar we export out goes to the US. Now, we've tried to diversify a bit, but we're still dependent on that. And that makes sense because of the way the North America manufacturing processes work on integrated supply, and just the way we work in supply chain management here. We're connected at the hip with the US. That hasn't changed, and it will continually change. Okay, it doesn't matter what Obama does in power or the Republican did. The supply chains are still the same here in terms of how we flow with automotive, forestry, whether that's oil. From the oil sands, we're connected together as kind of like one domestic market. So we have a dependency on the U.S. That's why, for example, if the U.S. has a sluggish economy, and that's what they've had for quite a few years, that's why you're seeing with the exports in 2009, they've gradually picked up both on the currency dollar, but as well as basically looking at the need and quality. The U.S. economy has been growing quicker the last few years than Canada, so the export demand's going up. So as you can see here, they're the biggest one. The next biggest trading partner here, export, is Europe. All we've done is we've always had trade with them. We've tried to solidify breaking down duties and import duties and excise taxes to basically look at ways to better leverage Canada's products into that. Like oil sands is a good example. If we can we've got deals in there, and Europe's recognized that the oil sands aren't dirty, then basically we've got that capacity to expand oil into Europe. Europe wants our oil. Europe prefer to have our oil than go to Middle Eastern oil. They rather have the reliance on us, so there's potential to upsell that energy sector. Now here's the downfall there is you do not get a coherent statement from the NDP on the energy sector. All they're saying is sustainable development. But yet you have a lot of radicals and people like Linda McQuaid in the NDP have came out and saying a lot of that oil should stay in the ground. So where is the stance on developing the energy sector, which would support exports, which would reduce the imbalance down? If you don't have that, where are you going to make up that deficit or gap? And we'll talk a little bit more specific when I look at the industry trends. Let's talk about now China. China now is another big country where over the last decade or so has become a global power. The more and more you look in the world in production and just the middle class growing in China, they're going to need demand for goods, and that means a lot of resource management, including oil. They've made some huge commitments in the oil sands as part of foreign direct investment. Now, that being said, they don't own the resources, they own the right to mine it. That's a misnomer that the NDP or in the Liberal Party will tell you, but Canada and the provinces themselves own the resources. We give them the rights to mine it. So we need to be careful and cognizant of that. So this one shows you overall that at the end of 2014, exports were about $528 billion. Let's look at imports now. It only makes sense that basically Canada, the bulk of 2/3 of its imports basically come from the United States. But in general, if you look at the imports, 81% of our imports come from 3 areas: Europe, China, and the United States. Now, the United States, we're talking about a lot of its automotive production, a lot of its refined oil. That's where we get a lot of our gas for our gas stations. Europe, we're getting into different products we bring in from Europe. A lot of that gets into electrical equipment. We get into machinery too. Boats and equipments and stuff like that. A lot of that comes in from Europe because that's where they're pretty strong in those areas as sectors of the economy. And China, most of what's driving imports in there, you like your Samsung TV, you like your iPhone, most of those are all produced there. So you're willing to want cheaper prices for those electronics equipment, so a lot of little companies in the electronics field have used China as a way to bring in stuff. Same with clothes and other aspects as well. Let's talk about trade imbalance. Canada's always had a pretty healthy trade imbalance with the United States, but that's where the rest of the world is where we have a problem. Now, if the NDP and the Liberal Party talked about the imbalances with the European Union, China, or Mexico, or even other countries, that would be one thing. But they've never talked about that. They just talk about the overall gap. And as you can see, in 2012 we peaked and had about $11 billion gap. But look at where a bulk of that gap is. Our exports were down with the US, so that part of led to some of the trade imbalances. But we were still basically having a lot of dependency bringing goods and services from other countries. Now let's stop there for a second. Okay? And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the other also includes countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Nigeria, South Africa, so some of these emerging markets. You're going to hear Colombia, South Africa. You're going to hear other countries that we're now talking about the next level of growth because they're starting to grow and develop and they need resources. Stephen Harper and his team, led by Ed Fast, have identified some of the next emerging markets where Canada should expand FIPA deals, which is the Investment Protection Act, or look at trade agreements with. What does Canada export? Well, if you look at this again, we're down a little bit, but we export on a monthly basis about anywhere between $42 to $45 billion worth of product. Look at where the bulk of that is. Energy is the biggest area. So about a good chunk of our resources is energy. Okay. Now, why do I say energy? That's the oil sands, and about a good chunk of that oil goes down to the U.S. The U.S. treats Canadian oil as domestic, so the bulk of our oil goes down there. The issue that you're dealing with there, the reason why you're seeing some of that has to do with the price drop. Oil took the biggest drop between November and December. It was dropping throughout last year, but the biggest drop happened between November and December. We're at about $50 a barrel now, but we still are exporting oil there. And I talked in the July analysis, and you're more welcome to go listen to my July market review, and I did basically talk about where oil basically, and looked at refinery capacity. It's come up in the U.S. We're producing more oil, but still the prices are down, and Canada doesn't control those prices. The other area that you're seeing in here is resource management. You're also seeing like metals, mining products. That's your aluminum, that's your nickel. We're a big, huge mining country. So if you take basically add the two together on exports, about 12 to 13 billion of our exports on a monthly basis, or a good one quarter of our exports are resource there. So if you hear the government talk about imbalances, how are they going to improve that? Well, either you make more goods here and export them out, or you continue to develop the resource sector. What party has really been talking about doing a combination of things? Well, Stephen Harper has put focus on advanced manufacturing. He's put focus on innovation funds to support next generation of food products, forestry, aerospace, even green energy. You do not hear the other parties talk about a widespread policy discussion around different products. What you do hear is from the NDP is they basically backpedal on natural resources. Why? Because they're being pushed by their own internal beliefs of green energy is the way they go. They really do not want to touch natural resources without putting restrictions on what can be done. Well, one quarter of our exports is natural resources. So how are you going to make up that $13 billion of exports by strictly going to green energy? Now, the green energy market in Canada in general is about $20 billion. And even if you grow at that at 12%, it will take at least a decade to get up to the point where you're not dependent on that. And the second thing is, you're never going to eliminate the complete carbon or minerals, because even with green energy technology, you need the raw materials to extract it. You also need the ability to fabricate it and deliver it. So that, in essence, you're still going to need the energy and the mining metals part as part of the production cycle. The other area that I wanted to highlight in here is that we basically export motor vehicle stuff. Okay, so we're still connected. We still are going to produce autos here, but we may not see as much investment because that policy is driven by provincial, where Kathleen and Dalton McGuinning in their way of life decided that we should push green energy at all costs, and that's wind and solar power. And yet Chrysler, Magnum Magnum Automotive basically said Ontario is not cost competitive anymore. If we're not cost competitive by provincial policies, it doesn't matter what the NDP does unless the provinces decide to get their input costs that they support in policies in check. The reason why I highlight that is because some of the policies that drive exports are outside the Conservative Party of Canada. Let's talk about imports. Well, consumer products is the big one here. So about 1/5 of all, 20% of all imports coming are consumer products. You want cheap stuff, right? Are you willing to pay a premium to buy a TV that's made here in Canada, or you still want to pay a cheaper price? People need to ask themselves about that, because that doesn't come up in the debate. We also import a lot of electrical equipment, industrial equipment from places like Europe, because they're known to build pretty good generators, pretty good boats. Like they've got the shipyards there. Some of the areas up in Norway, they build stuff. So you need to keep that in perspective as well. Where are the largest trade gaps? Now, if you're looking at areas and say to you, I'm going to close down these gaps, then we would have to look at industrial machinery, electrical equipment, motor vehicle, and consumer goods to kind of say, how can we produce those goods here in Canada? How can we bring in advanced manufacturing to support those goods produced here? Now, in order to do that, that would require a commitment on the manufacturing side, which Stephen Harper has done through various policies. The NDP is not clear on that, because what they've said is they will look at small business taxation cuts, but yet they want to enhance CPP. They also want to look at a carbon tax. That's not going to support input cost here at a federal level or any other aspects of a provincial policy here to make those goods more productive or cost effective here. And when you hear about trade imbalances, how are we going to go grab that? Wouldn't it make more sense to go after things that you can leverage your competitive experience or investment in, which is into the resource sector, and also look at ways that you can get into the midstream and downstream transactions that relate to the refining sector? Doesn't it make more sense to go after that kind of hanging fruit versus low margin areas? But you're not hearing that discussion from Thomas Mulcair or the Liberal Party of Canada. What you are hearing is basically green energy. It seems to be the only focus. Why? Because they're playing to that green vote. But if you're going to close that deficit down in trade, then you have to look at all aspects of your exports and see where you can improve value-added resources or value-added products. Is that being talked about? No, it's not. So you need to make those decisions as well. Now, I've added a little bit more to expand on here. Okay. Now, if you're really going to take a holistic view of policy and have discussions with them, then you need to say to these people, okay, you want to reduce the trade imbalances. Are you supporting oil or not? If you're not, then tell me that, because that impacts areas like Prince Rupert that would have pipelines coming across. It impacts the East-West pipeline, which would then move oil over to New Brunswick to an energy hub. It also impacts Newfoundland in terms of exporting that. Newfoundland also relies on basically iron ore exports, nickel. Quebec's huge in resources, forestry. So if you want a government that's incoherent on resource management, vote NDP. They're the party for you. If you want one that's looking at resource management, the Liberals talk a bit about it, but they're not going enough to it. If you really want a party that really is looking at the holistic view of supporting an economy, it's the Conservative Party of Canada. Now, you don't have to believe me. You just go out and look at the rhetoric and the statements. Okay, there's so many NDP people have spoken out against resource management, and yet they want that revenue in terms of the support, the $10 billion spending plan. That's what you need to look at. The other thing, too, that you have to ask yourself is Thomas Mulcair talks about innovation. He talks about it all the time in his speeches. What he doesn't talk about, there's already funds out there, and you're more welcome to Google it. There's an aerospace fund. There's a food and agricultural fund. There's automotive. There's actually forestry. There's different sectors. You can also Google the Southern Ontario Development Corporation that Stephen Harper created to help promote opportunities within Ontario. There's also the Western Canada Economic Council that actually looks at opportunity out there. Now, part of the reason I'm stating that, because these are not things that's ever discussed by either the Liberal Party or the NDP. If you want to look at trade, then you have to understand how I close that gap down. The reason why I wanted to kind of illustrate this is because I want to give you an opportunity to kind of ask questions about trade. Thank you so much.